Hello, my name is Professor Pat Paterson. I'm at the William J. Perry Center for Hemispheric Defense Studies at National Defense University in Washington, D.C. I'd like to speak today about a serious threat that many of the governments in Latin America face. Throughout Latin America, governments have called upon their armed forces to combat organized crime. These criminal groups, drug traffickers in Colombia or cartels in Mexico, maras in Honduras or gangs in Brazil, use violence to terrorize their opponents and have immense finances from illicit trafficking. The military, highly respected in most Latin American nations, has the discipline and the firepower to do the job. However, using the military in law enforcement operations is a double-edged sword, one that's fraught with complications. Soldiers, normally trained to annihilate an enemy using maximum lethal force, need extensive training on fighting an enemy that is mixed amongst the population. Soldiers without the proper training or education may commit human rights violations and jeopardize their legitimacy amongst the civilian population. Hence, the deployment of the military carries serious risks for the reputation of the military institutions throughout Latin America. Transnational Criminal Organizations, or TCOs, in Latin America represent the biggest current threat to security and stability in the region. These groups deal in drugs, arms, and people, and they rely upon illicit revenues to fund their operations. They represent an irregular threat to the traditional ideas of sovereignty. They are not controlled by a central government, they aren't restricted by national borders, and they don't represent a state. On the contrary, they have a highly decentralized command system and are more of a network of criminals than a cohesive military force. Their command structure is so decentralized that it's nearly impossible to defeat the enemy by capturing or killing the leaders. Since they deal in illicit black market products like drugs and weapons, the legitimate governments must fight against demand-side market forces. In other words, the enemy can use socioeconomic problems such as corruption, poverty, unemployment, or even disenfranchised youth to their advantage as a source of recruitment and motivation. TCOs are perhaps also the most formidable opponent that our militaries have faced in decades. They're equipped with heavy weaponry, including armor-piercing rifles and car bombs. They don't follow the laws of armed conflict that many modern developed militaries are obliged to follow under international law. They terrorize their opponents. They don't distinguish between non-combatants and other soldiers. They use blackmail and extortion extensively. They have extensive intelligence organizations, including human spies and advocates who have penetrated even the highest levels of government in some Latin American countries. For example, judges and state officials who are on the cartel payroll can provide political and legal protection for these groups, and they're extremely well funded. Estimates of drug profits for these cartels range from $19 billion to $39 billion each year. In these instances, the support and legitimacy of the civilian population is the center of gravity, the weakest and most vulnerable link of the enemy. It's the key to victory in the conflict. And although at risk of retaliation from cartel members, cooperative civilians can provide critical intelligence to security forces about the workings and whereabouts of cartel members. Likewise, if the security forces are perceived to be just, they will support security force presence, thereby permitting development projects in each of these neighborhoods. This, in turn, will deter other marginalized citizens from turning toward illicit activities as a source of income and further undermine the support of the criminal groups. Therefore, it's essential that security forces avoid causing collateral damage or innocent victims during these security operations. And since the enemy is often mixed amongst the population and operates amongst the civilians are often at risk of being caught in the crossfire or mistakenly attacked by security forces. Likewise, military forces not trained in these kind of civilian-centric operations may oftentimes use excessive force against civilians. Since support of the population is the key to victory, this kind of action is counterproductive to the long-term success of the mission. The most commonly known laws of armed conflict include the principles of discrimination, necessity, humanity, and proportionality. However, discrimination and distinction is perhaps the most important principle. It requires that parties to a conflict direct their actions only against combatants and military objectives, and that they take appropriate steps to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants. Military action should be directed at combatants and military targets, not at civilians or civilian property. During these operations against transnational criminal organizations, security forces must follow these rules in order to avoid causing violations of human rights. And this is hard to do under such savage and austere circumstances. The enemy is mixed amongst the population. Many members of the community might be colluding with the enemy, and the organized crime groups are an irregular force that does not wear uniforms and cannot be easily distinguished from innocent civilians. There's a number of other reasons that human rights violations occur in these circumstances, but in my opinion, and from my experience, the two most common reasons are lack of training and lack of education in these extremely complex operations. It's difficult to prepare the military forces for every contingency that they will face while conducting enforcement operations. In addition, there's many other important preparations that the militaries have to receive prior to deploying. Communications training, maneuvering and patrolling processes, weapons training, first aid, force protection, checkpoint procedures, civil affairs, the escalation of force, and so on. When military units are conducting law enforcement operations amidst the civilian population, soldiers frequently have to protect themselves and their units or other designated persons and properties that they're tasked to protect. In general, military forces are able to use lethal force when they are subject to a hostile act or hostile intent. A hostile act, the use of force against one's group, one's unit, is relatively easy to distinguish. It occurs when the unit, or something that the unit is tasked to protect, is taking fire from a criminal or from the enemy. However, what's far more difficult to determine in these circumstances is hostile intent. Hostile intent is defined as a threat of imminent use of force against one's unit or something that you're tasked to protect. In these domestic law enforcement operations, there's a vast array of scenarios that are possible. Soldiers may be required to set up checkpoints, roadblocks, provide crowd control, conduct house searches, or perform direct action operations against known enemy locations. In these circumstances, soldiers may encounter a wide range of hostile intent that they have to interpret on the spur of the moment. For example, can soldiers fire on protesters who are throwing stones? What if they're throwing bricks or Molotov cocktails? What level of force is permissible under these circumstances? What if a suspect is fleeing? Can soldiers fire upon him if he no longer represents a direct threat to the unit? Can he fire at an enemy if civilians are present or at risk of being hit? These are difficult determinations that need to be made by our young soldiers that are deployed in the streets. Military forces are always permitted to use self-defense to protect oneself or other fellow units. However, in these circumstances, over-reliance upon self-defense or force protection can be detrimental to the mission accomplishment. Oftentimes, forces are more concerned about force protection than they are about avoiding collateral damage. Using moderation of force and discrimination of targets even raises the risk for one's own unit. However, it's a necessary risk. If military forces open fire upon every perceived threat, mistakes will be made and civilians will be injured, and the confidence and the legitimacy of the military effort will be jeopardized. In short, it's necessary to assume additional risks in order to reach our military objectives. Units should consider avoiding collateral damage over force protection. In these circumstances, a tactical mistake made by a young officer or a young soldier can have strategic repercussions. General David Petraeus, our former commander of U.S. forces in Iraq, called these young soldiers strategic lieutenants or strategic corporals because an error of a squad leader or a platoon commander or a company officer can often generate waves of resentment and have strategic repercussions. Such actions can serve as a catalyst for massive protests. So there are many challenges and recommendations in these types of operations. Our military leaders in Latin America are facing a great challenge. They must train their soldiers so that they understand the rules of engagement in domestic law enforcement operations. They must also protect the civilians they're charged with defending, and they must protect themselves all at the same time. Many of our soldiers may be young and inexperienced, oftentimes scared or poorly trained, and even at times angry and emotional for the loss of comrades. Oftentimes, they're also confused and tired by the pace and demands of the deployment. However, at the same time, they must make life and death decisions in seconds. To many of them, it may seem that the system is designed to entrap them. Video cameras on every corner record their actions. The press and the non-government organizations are oftentimes scrutinizing their decisions, and international laws restrict and constrain their use of military force. Most militaries recognize that these risks are inherent in these types of law enforcement operations, and it's a mission that many of them don't seek out or even prefer. However, the security situation in most Latin American countries is so dire that there are few other options available to the country's political leadership other than to deploy the armed forces in these operations. Crime rates, personal insecurity, overcrowded and violent prisons, violations of human rights, all demand that the military deploy to help the police in these circumstances. As General John Galvin, our former commander of U.S. Southern Command, wrote in his often cited article, Uncomfortable Wars Toward a New Paradigm, he said, quote unquote, "An officer's effectiveness and chance for success now and in the future depend not only on his character, knowledge and skills, but also, and more than ever before, on his ability to understand the changing environment of the conflict. Thank you very much.